I'm Marty Cohn, and welcome to Brattleboro Community Television's Meet the Candidates 2022. This series affords you an opportunity to hear from folks running for elected office. Today, our guest is Representative Sara Coffey, who is the Democratic candidate running for Windham 1 State Representative. Welcome, Representative Coffey.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's learn about what you're all about. First question I have right out of the gate. Why are you seeking this office?
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, NBC TV, for having me and all the candidates here to learn more about why we're running. So I've been serving Guilford and Vernon for the last 4 years, and I ran for this office back in 2018 because I really care about the future of our rural communities. And a number of folks in my community asked me to run because they felt like they were not being represented in the way that they would have liked to have been. So, you know, it's been an incredible honor to serve Guilford and Vernon, and we have accomplished a good, I hope we'll get into this this afternoon. We've accomplished a lot, but I feel like there's still some more work. There's a lot more work to be done. You know, we just emerged out of what we call the COVID biennium, and COVID really revealed some of the fissures and gaps and inequities. And I think we were able, with the federal funding coming in, we were able to do a lot with that funding, but we really, we need to be following up, making sure that all of those initiatives, some of them are really innovative and creative, see how they're working, making sure that we're following through on our work. So I'm eager to return to the State House and be a strong voice for these two rural communities.
All right, great. Well, now this year you do have some competition. So let me ask you, what sets you apart from the other candidates seeking the office?
So, I don't really like to speak about what other people's positions are, and it's been actually challenging to find out much about my opponent because she doesn't have a functioning website or Facebook page, and she hasn't written anything. But I have been her state representative, so I've heard from her, and yesterday I got a flyer in the mail. So I think it's fair to say that Nancy Gassett is running as a Republican, but as a far right Republican. She's embraced a lot of the MAGA Republican ideas, and folks may have read the front page story on Tuesday's Reformer that Nancy had signed on to a letter with other Vermonters urging Vice President Mike Pence to not accept the results of the 2020 election. So, she's been associated with another divisive character person in our community in Guilford, Jason Herron. They're part of this Convention of States movement. I will let voters go and do some research on that. But I really feel like right now we are living in some divisive times. And in 2018 when I ran, I felt the same way. And I really am concerned about these divisions. And I really think we need leaders in Montpelier who can bridge these divides. And really, so much of the challenges that face Vermont are not partisan challenges. They face all of Vermonters. And we do need leaders and elected officials, folks who can work together. And one reporter once described me as my superpower was collaboration. And I take great pride in that. I come out of the field of the performing arts where collaboration is really key. And I've just loved getting to know the people who are outside of my normal sphere, normal circles, especially the folks in Vernon. And I find it a challenging district, but a really exciting district. There are a lot of good and interesting and innovative ideas and community projects and businesses in our community. So I'm really looking forward to continuing to be a positive voice for these two communities.
All right, great. Well, magic wand, you're elected. What would be your top 2 priorities if you're reelected?
So I will elaborate. Top two. I know 2. So right. The first is continuing to strengthen our rural economy. That touches on a number of issues like continuing the build out of rural broadband, childcare, affordable housing, and innovations in workforce development. The second is addressing climate change. I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but we have done significant work with the Global Warming Solutions Act, and there's a climate action plan that came out of the Climate Council. There are some really important initiatives and proposals in there, and there's a lot of work to be done. We've made some significant progress in this area, but I think there's a lot more work to do. And as I often say to people, if it was easy, we would have solved. If the problems and challenges were easy, we would have solved them. And so I think that it does take, both of these areas are complex and nuanced, and they are going to require investment. And there's going to be a lot, now that the federal inflow is ending soon, the competition for dollars are how we do this. We must be strategic, we must be nuanced, we must make sure that those dollars are well spent, and that we are really doing the best that we can do to build a strong future for our rural communities and for all of Vermont, because Vermont is a rural state, much to Burlington's surprise, maybe.
Well, and a lot of the issues are interrelated in terms of how we're solving. What I like to consider is the challenges. Yeah. So, what about the challenge of the rising costs of food, fuel, and other goods? What can we do in Montpelier about that?
Well, I say with every challenge is an opportunity, and I really believe in that because I think that's the way that I've approached the last several years. There's a limited amount of things that we can do as a state legislature around the cost of food and inflation. However, I think at the root of much of that is how do we help Vermonters who are dealing with food insecurity, and how do we help them with their fuel bills? And I think there are a number of strategies that we have put in place, such as making sure that farm to school has been a really important system changer for how we support both our local farmers and growers and getting that into our local schools and communities. The Everyone Eats program is another interesting example of when restaurants had to close and how do we keep them open? How can we help restaurants keep their employees and also delivering food to Vermonters? I mean, those were two really interesting examples, and they've spurred, in my community, they've spurred really interesting ideas. There's a great new organization called Neighborhood Roots, that is really taking this idea of food insecurity and doing something that looks a little bit akin to what early food co-ops looked like by buying local and doing bulk food buying, but they're also interested in expanding their network to folks who are living with food insecurity. That, in combination with the Farm to School program and educating kids about how we grow food and how we, prepare healthy food, has been a real hallmark of our elementary school in Guilford. And I see the same happening in Vernon too. So I really feel like those programs and continuing to address things like weatherization for low-income Vermonters and middle-income Vermonters so that they have less of a fuel bill and providing assistance where it's needed. I think creating this safety net is so important, and the pandemic really, once again, you might hear me say this a few times, it really revealed the gaps and inequities and where we can do better. And as a result, I think we've had some really fresh and innovative thinking. We're going to need to continue to do that. I hear about supply chain issues with construction and building. I think that will continue as we try to address the housing shortage. That will continue to be a problem in some cases, but I hope that we will be able to ease some of that. And some of the things are going to be a little bit outside of our control, which is not something that people want to hear. But to be realistic about it, there's regulation and laws that. We do live in a free market, and some of that is going to need to work its way out, and also at the federal level, of course, with interest rates and things like that. So it's going to be an interesting session ahead. I think our biggest concern is we work with our state economist and looking at the forecasting. We had one over the summer. And since the time I entered the legislature 4 years ago, we've been worrying about a recession. And, I think that's the big concern that we have. And when I just know for my family, the pandemic was a huge strain on my family. And we are economically okay. And we have a house that is, buttoned up and everything, but for Vermonters who had, real struggles, economic, mental health, or health, we're really I feel like we're just beginning to see the real impacts. And I think we're going to be needing to pay a lot of attention to really bolster and create a real safety net. Because honestly, if we don't, when we do address the health of all Vermonters, Vermont thrives, and it's good for us economically, and we have a strong workforce, and and so on and so forth. And the repercussions, the ripple effect is there. So I have my eye very much on the economy. When I've done my door knocking, it's been refreshing. I have a lot of small business owners in my community and workers, and I have been relieved to find that they are doing okay. That many of the things that we put in place from the pandemic relief help them, bridge the worst of it. And, we hear about some of the innovative strategies that small businesses have done to keep their workers, to keep them engaged, employed. And I think that was made me feel quite optimistic. We know that we still have some challenges with workforce. We have a aging Vermont population, and people took early retirement. That's having a huge impact on our ability to hire. But also, I think, as we continue to work on creating more affordable housing, we're going to be, and better, stronger broadband and keeping our schools strong, we are going to attract younger families to move to Vermont. And that's always been a challenge. And but I now actually see that we're making some progress.
All right, well, but let me ask you, though, if we attract these folks to Vermont, something else that the pandemic has made us aware of is the housing crisis.
Yes.
What can we do about that?
Yeah, I think it's complex. We've done a lot, and I'm going to refer to some of my notes because we did a significant amount. And building new housing, as you know, takes time. It doesn't emerge overnight. We have something in Vermont with the property transfer tax that is a beautiful nexus of when rising the price of housing rises, so does that number, the property transfer tax. And that number, that funding is supposed to go into building affordable housing. And so that, in combination with some of the COVID relief dollars that we had, it led to, over the past 3 years, that we invented $375 million in housing. Wow. Which is really significant. I don't know if Vermonters know how much that was. And it was not in all of the same kind of housing. I think I hear sometimes it's all Section 8 housing. And that's actually quite the contrary. We did a couple, if you don't mind, I'm going to elaborate on some of the things that we did this last year. So, in addition to addressing homelessness and providing shelter for the homelessness, we invested funding to build more than 1,000 units of housing for affordable and for low and middle income families. We dedicated $20 million towards forgivable loans to property owners to bring some of their rental properties up to rentable standards and up to code, plus incentives for construction of accessory dwelling. $22 million to subsidize new construction to lower costs for middle-income home buyers, plus $1 million for Vermont Housing Finance with VHFA is what it's often referred to, for down payment grants for first-generation home buyers. We've been doing a lot of work to reform zoning laws to make it easier for developers to come in and do this work by expanding tax credits and creating a couple of pilot projects. And it's going to be really interesting to see, the fruits of that. We've also there were a number of other things that I could go into, but I just want folks to know. I hope that is a strong signal that the legislature is taking this quite seriously. I think the other thing, I was part of a number of focus group discussions around housing, and what I was hearing from a lot of folks who are seniors, they want to stay in Vermont. They're in these homes that they can no longer really maintain and afford. How can we help those folks? We know we have an aging population. How do we help those folks stay in Vermont and then those homes become available and on the market? Mm-hmm. And I think there could be way to incentivize that. We incentivize those folks who are selling their homes, if we can help them into affordable housing themselves, that we that we can incentivize them to sell them, not to second home owners, people with second homes, but people who are going to be teachers, police officers, nurses, doctors in our communities. These are things that we know we need. So I think it's going to take some creative thinking, and it's going to take a little bit of time to see where that housing develops. There's a big project in Bellows Falls, and I'm really excited about the work that's being done, the thinking that's being done around the Winston Prouty campus. We got some early highlights from that, but I think there's some real possibilities that look like another kind of housing, not apartment buildings, but almost like what I would call co-housing, having mixed housing. And one of the things I remember, my mother has been a huge influence in my life. One of the things I remember in the 70s when I was growing up, my mother thought of, we don't want to create housing that puts all the same kind of people together, like whether it's seniors or whether it's low-income folks, or, we want to have mixed housing so that we can build healthy communities. And I think that is something that I strive for, and I want to see us doing more of that. So
that's great.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, let me shift to another challenge, public safety.
Yes.
What can we do to enhance public safety? And I don't I don't want to give the impression that about violence in Vermont, but public safety is definitely an important component of it. What can we do in the legislature about that?
Sure. So, I have served, I've been the vice chair of the Corrections and Institutions Committee, so we have taken a very deep dive on this. And so there are a lot of different ways to look at public safety. Our committee sees the end, and there's a continuum within our criminal justice system. We see the corrections, looking at corrections policy, but we know it's all connected. And so there are really some systemic issues. And I would say that for the most part, my big takeaway is we're mostly incarcerating poor people, which is just tragic. But over the past 3 years, after my first year, we managed to get a grant, the state to get a grant for the 3 branches of state government to work with the Council of State Governments, their Justice Center, to work on something that's called justice reinvestment. And it's a way of looking at how do we incarcerate fewer people, without jeopardizing public safety. So and I think in Vermont, we have really reduced the number of people who are incarcerated. People are out in community supervision, and that's a good thing. Vermont has some of the lowest crime rates in the nation. We're the 3rd lowest across the nation, which I think people forget in this age of where we're hearing a lot about public, the law enforcement, the challenge attracting officers to become part of law enforcement in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement. The way I see it is I think we really do need to reimagine policing and public safety. And it's not by defunding the police, it's about retraining, reorganizing. I mean, in Vermont, we recently put in, he was the deputy commissioner of the Department of Mental Health, to work with the public service, to work with police and creating kind of curriculum that would, a lot of our officers are being called on to respond to mental health crises. The thing that is actually where crime has risen in Vermont is around domestic violence. We have seen a direct correlation between the presence of guns and domestic violence. And this is deeply disturbing. And so I've seen this in my committee, but I've also seen this, I've been the co-chair of the Women's Caucus. And we've taken some significant and important steps around this, because unfortunately, where Vermont has been at the leading edge of a lot of criminal justice reform, we have under-resourced domestic violence prevention and response. And so continuing with our work with the Council on State Governments, the beautiful thing about the working with CSG is that it involves the 3 branches of state government. So there's going to need to be more money for, education and prevention. We did a little bit of that work in my committee by taking some of these dollars that we're saving from out-of-state beds, the spending on that, because we have reduced our numbers. We're taking some of that money and putting it into programs for people who are being released from an incarcerative setting, who are in on domestic violence charges, for them to get part of this. Have access to these programs free of charge. Previously, people had to pay for it, which just seems to me to be a huge obstacle and kind of wrong. It seems like that is not how we interrupt the cycle of incarceration. So, I think we passed some important legislation. I was supportive of it around putting 48-hour limits on firearm purchases to make sure that guns are not getting into the hands of dangerous people or people who shouldn't have them. That shouldn't inhibit a responsible gun owner at all, But it also had some language in there for a judge or courts to remove firearms from a scene of domestic violence. And I'm hoping, this is new legislation that was just passed last year. I'm hoping that we're going to see some of the impacts of that legislation that will result in reducing violent crime in our communities. We are, however, I don't want to skirt the issue of, we are dealing with a workforce issue and for state police and local police. And in my two towns, we don't have police departments. We rely on contracts with the sheriff's department and the state police. And we're increasingly hearing, I'm hearing from, I've met with my local fire department in Guilford and saying, they're getting increasingly concerned about responding to being the first responders when there are some calls of, to a mental health crisis. Because sometimes there can be guns on site, sure, and they don't have that training. Mm-hmm. So I'm not trying to skirt the issue. I think we're having workforce issues in a lot of areas, and this is one of great concern. And the delegation has recently met with our state's attorney here in Windham County to discuss some of this and where we need to be looking at how we can make sure that law enforcement and our state's attorneys have the tools that they need to be able to hold people who are dangerous to our public safety. So, and I've heard there's a lot going on in Brattleboro as well with this. I hate to bring this up, but I'm going to bring up the elephant in the room, which is about using in public, like people, this concern around people using opioids in public, and I'm especially concerned around that happening in areas where I call our youth corridor in town or around our schools. Our youth corridor being Flat Street, where the Boys and Girls Club, New England Youth Theater, and the Latches Arts is, and the River Gallery School. So I think that these are, the greatest thing about being in a small state is that we can tap the people, like this a great sense of collaboration. And before the pandemic hit, there was some really fantastic collaboration going on between our community justice centers, law enforcement, our fire department, some of the folks who are working in our recovery community to really come together to take a really multifaceted approach to this. And I really believe that we need to get back to that, and we need to fund that kind of activity, it's in the past, I think there's been a lot put onto our communities without funding. And I think that that's the kind of collaborative effort that needs to have some funding to be able to address some of these systemic solutions. I don't think we're going to solve them overnight, but I really think, we have a really vibrant downtown in Brattleboro. We have great opportunities and arts activities and economic opportunities. We want this to be a safe community for people and for businesses. And we actually want to make sure that folks who are dealing with substance use disorder have access to the resources that they need. And I'll end with this. We passed some important legislation in the House and the Senate that the governor vetoed that took some of that important funding that would have been made available to folks. And I think that those kinds of actions really undermine the work that we're trying to do to address that kind of this systemic issue. We're experiencing this opioid crisis. I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, but it's we're losing people. We're losing Vermonters to this, to addiction, and we need to make sure that we are responding to this crisis with adequate resources that to address it.
Thank you for that answer. It's definitely a very complicated issue, and I'm going to bring up another one. You alluded to it before, the climate crisis. Yes. Something that's definitely reshaping life in Vermont. The legislature did pass we had the Vermont Climate Council release its climate action plan, yeah, and that's a blueprint. So let me ask you, briefly, which pieces of the climate action plan would you take up if you were reelected?
Sure. So I'm really excited about this work. And it was the Global Warming Solutions Act that was legislation that we passed in 2020. The governor vetoed it. We overrode that veto, and that created the Climate Council, which, yes, created this climate action plan. And I'm just the goals of those, we put in statute what our targets had been, which is that we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions in Vermont 25% below 2005 levels by the year 2025, 40% below 1990 levels by the year 2030, and 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. And so really, these are ambitious goals, right, and they can really only be met if we have really aggressive action. One of the pieces of legislation that aimed to do that this last session that was vetoed by the governor was the clean heat standard. That was the top policy recommendation that came out of the climate action plan. And I think there was a lot of misinformation about it. There was a lot of fear. I heard this from my constituents. There was a lot of fear that was going to lead to rising fuel costs. But this legislation was actually developed with a lot of the fuel suppliers in consort with them, and it was really about having more options available to Vermonters to transition to clean energy, clean heat. Didn't force anybody to do it. I can imagine people who are in their 70s, 80s, like in the old home, they're probably not going to have the inclination or resources perhaps to make the shift, but there are incentives for people who can. And addressing our heating, we call it the thermal sector, is one of the best ways that we can do it. So we've done a lot around weatherization. We need to keep investing to have what we call weatherization at scale, so that we can rapidly increase the number of homes that are weatherized, because through conservation, we can accomplish a lot. But the clean heat standard, by moving people by heating with fossil fuels, not only does it help us get to our greenhouse gas emission targets, it also takes away the instability of that market, which we've experienced already because of many factors, the war with Ukraine and Russia being one of them. But moving to the electrical moving people as much as possible over to electrification for heating, but also for transportation, is the path that I see forward, and that's the climate action plan includes that. So in addition to I think we will be revisiting the clean heat standard, and we'll be working, we will do our best to work with this governor to find out where he can come on board with this, or she, our next governor. We don't know who that's going to be, I shouldn't say. So, but we I've been part of a small group of legislators that's part of a renewable energy, it's not a task force, but it's like a learning community. And so the other big challenge is how, if we move to electrification, does Vermont have the infrastructure to support that? So we've been hearing a lot from a number of our partners in the energy community about how we can do that. And some of that is we're going to be needing to look at some of the incentives to move for companies to move towards renewable energy, but we're also going to need to invest in infrastructure. And so with some of the recent legislation coming out of the federal government, we hope that there will be some funding to help us continue to modernize our grid in that capacity. And there are a lot of ideas in that climate plan. I think there was something like 56 recommendations, and so we have some really terrific partners working with us. I'm part of the Climate Solutions Caucus, and we have some terrific partners working with us, because as you know, or I don't know how much voters know, we don't have, legislators don't have staff to do the research, the policy research. We have attorneys who help us work and write and develop legislation, and they do some of the research. But compared to our members of Congress, who have pretty large stables, I would say by comparison, we need to work with some folks. We need to work with a lot of folks in our community who can help us do this work, because this is one of the largest challenges facing Vermont. And I have to say, Republicans seem to want to put their head in the sand and think that the federal government is going to solve that. Now, when I have been out knocking on my doors, that's not what my constituents want us to do. They want to be part of the solution. And I don't think that it's not only can we do it, we must do it. So it is one of the biggest challenges, and it's a challenging time to be in the legislature to do it. But I really think that we have a blueprint, as you called it, and I think we need everybody to lean in. And it's going to be challenging because investments in this are going to be put up against the investments that we need to put in for childcare and for workforce development. So it's going to be very challenging. But I'm somebody who actually follows the work of the money committees. My committee is a money committee, and policies. If you don't have the money, the financial picture along with it, I think can often fall short, or they can be unfunded mandates, is what we often hear from a number of folks, whether it's people working in our municipalities or working in the field. So, I want to be strategic and smart, and I feel like there is such urgency. We're already feeling it in Vermont with how our weather is changing, and I think there is widespread agreement that is being caused by climate change. So how do we, the third important piece I think to all of this is how do we build resiliency for our communities, especially our rural communities. We remember Irene, and I think we are working very systematically, and we have the help of the Vermont League of Cities and Towns and our planning commissions working with our municipalities, but we're going to need to put funding behind that so that we are ready, and that we can help, not just funding, but technical expertise. Small towns like Guilford and Vernon are different from towns like Bellows Falls and Brattleboro that have larger staffs that can do this work. We are reliant on volunteers. So getting that technical expertise to our select boards and our planning commissions is going to be really important too.
All right, well, last question.
Sure.
It's probably going to be the toughest question, all right? What do you want voters to know about you?
Well, I think can I say two things?
Yes.
Two. All right. So a couple things. One is that, I want folks to know that I am somebody who has progressive social values, but I'm very fiscally responsible. So how those two things work together is important for people to know. And that those values, my values are really informed by my upbringing and working in the performing arts field. I grew up in a working class family in Massachusetts. My dad was a security guard at our state hospital, and my mom was she worked part-time and then full-time as an editor. There were times when we were stretched very thin, where my family had to rely on food stamps to get by, and I had to work after school to, buy my clothes in high school. But what it taught me was about resiliency, and it taught me how to think outside the box, and it taught me how to rely on my neighbors and friends. So I really bring those values and that spirit of collaboration with me into my work. I'm really thinking about working class families when I do this work. I feel like they are the backbone of our communities in Vermont. So
great. Well, Representative Sara Coffey, Democratic candidate for Windham 1 State Representative. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you for the invitation, Marty.
You can learn more by visiting the campaign website at www.saracoffeyvt.com. www.saracoffeyvt.com.
That's right.
Okay. The general election is Tuesday, November 8th. Remember, you can vote early in person. You can vote absentee by mail. You can vote absentee hand-delivered on Election Day. Whichever way works for you, please vote. Thanks for watching Meet the Candidates 2022. I'm Marty Cohn. Stay healthy.